Right now, inside your body, there's a tiny army working a night shift you never asked for and never had to train. It moves through your cells like a cleanup crew walking through a building after hours, checking every room, flagging anything broken, and hauling away what doesn't belong. It doesn't punch a clock, it doesn't take weekends off, and when it's working properly, it may be one of the most powerful cancer prevention tools your body already owns. No prescription required. Scientists call this process autophagy, and in 2016, the researcher who mapped out how it works won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for the discovery. That's not a small deal. That's the kind of recognition reserved for findings that reshape how we understand human health at a cellular level. And yet most people have never heard the word, and almost everyone who has heard of it assumes the same thing, that you need to starve yourself for days before it turns on. That assumption is wrong, and it's costing people a genuine opportunity to protect themselves. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what autophagy is, why it matters so much for cancer prevention, and 5 ways to switch it on that have nothing to do with punishing multi-day fasts. Some of these will surprise you. One of them might already be sitting in your kitchen. And stick around until the end, because the research finding that closes this video out is the one that actually changes how you should think about all of this. Most people get it backwards, and once you hear it, you won't be able to unhear it. Before we go any further, it's worth sitting with just how strange and how remarkable this system really is. You didn't have to lear-en it. You didn't have to switch it on. It was running before you were born, and it will keep running quietly in the background of every single cell in your body for the rest of your life. Most of what we're taught about staying healthy focuses on things we add: more exercise, more vegetables, more sleep. Autophagy flips that script. It's about what your body removes. And removal, it turns out, might be just as important as anything you put in. Let's start with what autophagy actually is, because the name gives it away once you break it down. It comes from Greek, and it literally translates to self-eating. Now that sounds a little unsettling, but it's actually on E of the most elegant systems in human biology. Think of each of your cells as a small self-contained apartment. Over time, that apartment accumulates wear and tear: broken furniture, expired food in the fridge, appliances that no longer work quite right. If nothing ever got cleaned out, the apartment would eventually become unlivable. Autophagy is the cleaning crew. Specialized structures inside the cell go searching for damaged proteins, worn-out mitochondria, the tiny structures that generate energy, and, critically, cells that have started behaving abnormally. Once identified, this debris gets wrapped in a protective membrane, dragged to the cell's internal recycling center, and broken down into raw material. That raw material doesn't get thrown away. It gets reused to build new, healthy components. Nothing is wasted. It's recycling at the molecular level, running quietly in the background of every cell in your body, right now, whether you're paying attention to it or not. Here's why this matters so much when we talk about cancer, specifically. Cancer rarely appears out of nowhere in a single dramatic moment. It's almost never one catastrophic event. Instead, it tends to build gradually. A small mistake in how a cell copies its DNA, a minor malfunction in how it manages energy, a slightly abnormal growth signal that T goes unchecked. On their own, these glitches are common and usually harmless because your body has systems designed to catch them early. Autophagy is one of the most important of those systems. It functions as quality control, identifying cells that are starting to drift toward abnormal behavior and either correcting the problem or clearing it out before it has the chance to snowball into something dangerous. In that sense, autophagy isn't just a cellular tidying up process. It's active surveillance against the earliest stages of disease. But here's the part almost nobody tells you, and it's the single most important thing to understand before we go any further. Autophagy is not a switch that's permanently flipped to on. It runs at a baseline level all the time, but its intensity is controlled by very specific biological signals. In modern daily life, constant snacking, climate-controlled, comfort, late nights scrolling on a lit screen, meals loaded with the same macronutrients every single day, quietly suppresses many of those signals without you ever noticing. You're not doing anything wrong on purpose. You're just living in an environment that never asks your cells to ramp up their cleanup crew. Well, the good news is that once you understand which signals switch autophagy on, you can start sending your body those signals deliberately, and you don't need to go anywhere near extreme fasting protocols to do it. Let's get into the first one, because it's probably the most underappreciated lever available to you, and it has almost nothing to do with how much you eat overall. It's about protein specifically. Most people have heard that fasting triggers autophagy. That's true, and it happens largely because fasting lowers insulin and activates a cellular energy sensor called AMPK, which essentially tells your cells, resources are limited right now, go find something to recycle. But there's a second pathway working alongside that one, and it revolves around a signaling system called mTOR. Think of mTOR as your cell's growth thermostat. When mTOR detects that protein is abundant, it flips into growth mode and, importantly, it suppresses autophagy at the same time. That combination, grow now, clean up later, makes sense in a world of scarcity where extra protein might not come around again soon. The problem is that cancer cells are exceptionally good at hijacking that growth signal. Overactive mTOR signaling shows up as one of the most consistently disrupted pathways across many different cancer types. Because cells that are dividing abnormally love an environment that keeps telling them to keep growing and skip the cleanup. When mTOR senses that protein is scarce instead of abundant, it does the opposite. It dials back the growth signal and shifts the cell toward recycling mode, switching autophagy back on to clear out accumulated debris. Researchers publishing in the journal Cell Metabolism found something genuinely striking here. Periodic restriction of protein activated autophagy about as powerfully as calorie restriction did. And it suppressed mTOR activity independently across multiple different tissues in the body. In plain terms, you don't necessarily need to eat less food overall to get this benefit. You need to occasionally eat less protein. The practical version of this is refreshingly simple, and it's something you could start this week without overhauling your entire diet. Pick one day out of every 7 and deliberately lower your protein intake for that day. Lean into vegetables, fruit, whole grains, and legumes, and keep animal protein and other protein-dense foods to a small amount. On the other 6 days, eat normally and make sure you're getting enough protein to support your muscles, your metabolism, and everyday recovery. The anti-cancer signal here doesn't come from starving your body of protein long-term. In fact, chronic protein deficiency is its own health problem, and it can undermine muscle mass, immune function, and recovery if taken too far. The benefit comes specifically from the cycling, the up and down rhythm that keeps mTOR from getting too comfortable sitting in growth mode all the time. Think of it like a manager who never gets a day off. If mTOR is constantly being told resources are plentiful, keep growing. It never has a reason to pause and let the cleanup crew through. Give it 1 day a week where the signal changes, and suddenly the whole system gets an opportunity to shift gears. You're not fighting your biology here. You're simply giving it permission to do something it's already built to do. Now let's move to something that sounds like it has nothing to do with cancer prevention at first glance. Heat. When your body is exposed to significant heat stress, think a proper sauna session, not just a warm room, your cells activate what's called the heat shock response. This is an ancient survival mechanism, and one of its central features is a dramatic spike in autophagy, specifically aimed at clearing out the damaged proteins that heat stress produces. But there's a second layer to this that makes it especially relevant for cancer prevention. The heat shock proteins generated during this response don't just help clean up the mess, they also act like flares, helping direct your immune system's attention toward cells that look abnormal. As autophagy clears away the debris created by heat exposure, it exposes markers on the surface of unhealthy cells that would otherwise stay hidden, making those cells far easier for your immune system to spot and eliminate. This isn't just a theoretical mechanism dreamed up in a lab. A large study published in JAMA Internal Medicine followed people who used a sauna regularly, somewhere between 4 and 7 sessions a week, and found roughly a 40% reduction in all-cause mortality compared to those who rarely or never used one, with researchers pointing to reduced cancer mortality as one of the likely contributing factors. That's an enormous effect size for something as simple as sitting in a hot room. If you want to put this into practice, aim for sessions lasting around 15 to 20 minutes at temperatures in the range of 80 to 100 degrees Celsius, ideally several. Even a handful of shorter sessions per week appears to offer meaningful benefit, and building up gradually is far more sustainable than forcing yourself into a routine you'll quit after 2 weeks. If you don't have regular sauna access, don't panic. A hot bath or steam room can offer a milder version of the same heat shock response, even if the research base behind those specific alternatives is thinner than what we have for traditional sauna use. And if none of that is available to you either, don't worry. We're only getting started, and there are other paths to the same destination. Trigger number 3 is actually a pair of compounds working together, and this is where nutrition gets genuinely interesting, because these aren't exotic supplements you need a prescription for. They're things you can find in ordinary food. The first is spermidine, a naturally occurring compound found in wheat germ, mushrooms, aged cheese, and legumes. Spermidine activates autophagy directly by switching off an enzyme that normally keeps the process suppressed. What makes this particularly relevant for cancer prevention is that spermidine-induced autophagy appears to selectively target cells that have started accumulating abnormal proteins, which happens to be one of the defining features of early precancerous cells. A long-running, 20-year prospective study following human participants found that people with higher dietary intake of spermidine had independently lower cancer mortality, even after accounting for other factors. That's the kind of finding that turns a curious lab observation into something you'd actually want to act on at your next grocery run. The second compound in this pair is urolithin A, and it has a more unusual origin story. You don't get urolithin A directly from food. Your gut bacteria produce it after metabolizing certain natural compounds found in pomegranates, walnuts, and berries. Once produced, urolithin A activates a specialized branch of autophagy called mitophagy, which focuses specifically on clearing out damaged mitochondria. This matters because damaged mitochondria don't just quietly sit there doing nothing. They generate excess oxidative stress and abnormal metabolic activity, creating exactly the kind of unstable internal environment that precancerous cells can exploit to survive and multiply. Clearing out that damaged machinery removes one of the earliest advantages a rogue cell might otherwise have. If you want to support both of these pathways through food, look for wheat germ, mushrooms, soybeans, green peas, pomegranates, walnuts, and raspberries. A combination that reads less like a supplement stack and more like a well-stocked produce aisle. One important caveat worth knowing, not everyone's gut bacteria convert those pomegranate and walnut compounds into urolithin A with the same efficiency. Some people are naturally efficient producers, others less so, which is part of why researchers have gotten increasingly interested in gut microbiome health as its own piece of the cancer prevention puzzle. Eating a varied, fiber-rich diet that supports a diverse gut microbiome may end up mattering just as much as eating the specific foods themselves. The fourth trigger flips the heat strategy on its head entirely. Cold exposure. Where heat stress activates autophagy through the heat shock response, cold exposure gets there through a completely different route. Exposure to cold triggers a surge in norepinephrine, which activates that same AMPK energy sensor we talked about earlier, the one that essentially tells your cells resources are tight and it's time to clean house. That activation suppresses the mTOR growth pathway, the same pathway that so many cancer cells depend on to keep dividing. Fewer growth signals available to abnormal cells is a meaningful advantage on its own. But cold exposure does something else too. It mobilizes natural killer cells, which are essentially your immune system's dedicated cancer surveillance unit, constantly patrolling for cells that look wrong. Autophagy and these natural killer cells work as a team here, as autophagy clears cellular debris and exposes abnormal markers on unhealthy cells. Natural killer cells become far more effective at finding and destroying them. The good news is that you don't need an ice bath in your backyard to get a meaningful dose of this. The simplest and most sustainable way to practice cold exposure is to finish your regular morning shower with 1 to 2 minutes of genuinely cold water. Cold plunges and ice baths are certainly an option if that appeals to you, but for most people, ending a normal shower on a cold note is far more realistic to stick with long term, and consistency appears to matter more here than intensity. Doing this daily seems to produce stronger, steadier autophagy activation and immune benefits than occasional, more extreme cold exposure sessions that people tend to abandon after a week or two. Which brings us to the fifth trigger, and it might be the least glamorous item on this entire list, but don't let that fool you into underestimating it. Sleep quality. This is one of the most overlooked levers in the entire conversation around autophagy, and it deserves far more attention than it gets. During deep sleep, your body ramps autophagy up to some of its highest levels of the day, not just in the brain, which is where most people assume the cleanup happens, but throughout virtually every tissue in your body. Deep sleep is also when your immune system performs some of its most thorough inspections, with natural killer cells actively patrolling tissue for cells that have begun dividing abnormally. In other words, poor sleep doesn't just leave you groggy the next day. It means your body's overnight cleanup and surveillance shift gets cut short or interrupted. The evidence connecting this to long-term cancer risk is not subtle. Research published in Nature Reviews Cancer found that disruption to your circadian rhythm, irregular sleep schedules, night shift work, chronic sleep deprivation, was independently associated with meaningfully higher rates of multiple cancer types. That's a sobering finding, but it also hands you something genuinely actionable. The quality and consistency of your sleep is a lever you can pull starting tonight. The single most effective thing you can do here is protect a consistent bedtime and wake-up time every day, including weekends, ideally staying within about a 45-minute window. Your body's internal clock thrives on predictability, and a stable rhythm appears to be one of the most powerful, low-effort ways to keep this entire system running the way it's supposed to. If you find your sleep quality could use extra support, magnesium glycinate is a form of magnesium commonly used to promote relaxation and support better sleep, and it's worth noting that a large share of adults worldwide don't get adequate magnesiums. Through diet alone, something to be mindful of and worth discussing with a healthcare provider if you think it might apply to you. Now, let's circle back to that discovery we teased at the very beginning, because this is the piece that reframes everything you just learned. For years, the dominant narrative around autophagy has centered almost entirely on prolonged fasting. The idea that you need to go multiple days without food before your body's cleanup crew really gets to work. And to be fair, that's not wrong. Prolonged fasting genuinely does activate autophagy, and for some people, under the right guidance, it can be an effective strategy. But here's what the broader body of research actually shows when you step back and look at it as a whole. The highest levels of everyday, baseline autophagy don't come from relying on one extreme intervention. They come from stacking several complementary triggers together consistently as part of an ordinary week. Protein cycling one day, a sauna session or two, a minute of cold water at the end of your shower, foods that naturally support spermidine and urolithin production, a stable bedtime. None of these individually sounds dramatic. Together, they add up to something far more powerful than any single extreme measure and, just as importantly, something you can actually sustain for years, not just for the 10 days you can white-knuckle your way through a strict fasting protocol. That distinction matters more than people realize, because researchers estimate that somewhere between 45 and 50% of all cancers are linked to modifiable lifestyle factors. That's not a small footnote. That's nearly half. It means the daily choices you make, the ones that feel too small to matter, may genuinely influence whether abnormal cells get caught and cleared early, or whether they get the chance to gain a foothold. None of this is about achieving perfection or overhauling your entire life overnight. It's about consistently stacking a few of these signals into your normal week and letting your body do what it already knows how to do. So, what does actually stacking these triggers look like across a normal week without turning your life into a science experiment? Picture something like this. Early in the week, you finish your morning shower with a minute or two of cold water. Small, uncomfortable, for about 60 seconds and done. A couple of times that week, you fit in a sauna session, or a hot bath if that's what's available to you, for 15 to 20 minutes. One day, you deliberately eat lighter on protein and heavier on plants. Throughout the week, you're snacking on walnuts, tossing mushrooms and green peas into meals, and reaching for berries instead of something processed. And every single night, you're protecting roughly the same bedtime and wake time, treating that consistency as non-negotiable as brushing your teeth. None of this requires a gym membership, a specialized clinic, or a dramatic lifestyle overhaul. It requires a handful of small, repeatable choices that, stacked together, send your body a very different message than the one most modern routines send by default. It's also worth being honest about what this can and can't do. None of these 5 triggers are a guarantee, and no legitimate researcher would ever claim otherwise. Cancer is influenced by genetics, environment, chance, and dozens of factors outside anyone's control. What the research does suggest is that supporting your body's own surveillance and cleanup systems appears to shift consistently over years and decades is exactly how meaningful risk reduction actually works in real life. It's rarely one dramatic decision. It's usually thousands of small ones. Before you go, it's worth saying clearly, none of this replaces regular medical checkups, screenings, or the guidance of your own doctor, especially if you have a personal or family history of cancer or any other health condition. Think of everything in this video as a way to support your body's own defenses, not a substitute for professional care. If something here resonated with you, the most useful next step isn't to try and implement all 5 triggers overnight. It's to pick just one, start this week, and build from there. Small, sustainable habits, repeated consistently, tend to beat dramatic, short-term efforts every single time. And if you found this useful, there's more ground to cover, including which everyday foods may be quietly working against your cells rather than for them, which is exactly what we'll dig into next.